Days and nights on the fishing boat as it worked its way south down the east coast were comfortingly monotonous for Osrith, and more than once she had been grateful for the splash of the waves or the flap of the oiled cloth sail which soothed her senses. Journeying with fishermen had been a clever plan, Osrith told herself, for the retreat to a functional world of nets, piles of fish corpses. Trading between ships meant she was no longer tied to the land and, consequently, to a lord, and her paying for passage was enough to get her left alone as Gert and Ulf, the Frisian fishermen, went about their trade. Though they were passing through Danish sea lanes, the fisher boat was barely challenged at any port in which they landed down the east coast. It did not stop at Bibbenberg, much to Osrith's relief. Gert had tried to explain, as far as Osrith understood, that their presence was unwelcome, and she was relieved when they skirted past the high fortress of her former home, armed as it had been in the days of her memory when she had fled, by ranks of bowmen aiming belligerently at the boat. Once Girom was in sight, Osrith had breathed easier and had continued to unpick the fishing lines, a job which Ulf had abandoned to pull the sheet of the sail which sped it along the coast. Gert and his brother Ulf spoke Frisian to one another, which was difficult to understand, though they got by in English with Osrith. It was clear Ulf did not much like Osrith and would bar her way when the crates of salted herring were loaded inboard, something for which Osrith was grateful, for the stench was truly awful. On a few mornings, Osrith had awoken under her blanket to a low argument between the brothers which she gathered, by Ulf's sharp gesticulating in her direction. He disagreed with his brother's decision for her to be aboard. Further, that Ulf had wanted to prevent her from working on the boat, but she continued to mend their nets, clean the boat, in fact anything Osrith was not prevented from doing by the elder brother, which kept her mind off Alba. Of Alba and Domnall and Constantine, of Eirik and Siegfried, and whoever has won the battle before do not as keep like walls. Of Domnall and Seinid and Tagged, most of all Tagged, whose face would skip into her mind's eye as they skirted south around the east coast of the land, trading fish, as Gert's skilled handling of his boat reminded Osrith of Tagged's easy proficiency, of how he had brought them round the Galloway headland to Caerligwylid, past jagged rock formations hidden just below the surface of the sea which might otherwise have scuppered a less talented captain. Osrith's chest pained when she thought Tagged. She had come to love him, almost without realizing it until he had said so too, and had been determined to make a life with him. For him to die in that burning church was horrific, and yet, they had barely been in one another's company and, Osrith had to admit, she had hardly been faithful since she had spoken the hand-wed oath that summer's day with the Morrigan present around them. Though, she had when it counted, Osrith told herself. When she had realized that she wanted to be his wife entirely, she had done as had Tagged. But it had been too late. The promises they had made one another before the battle were for all too brief a time. Spray from the dipping boat splashed into her face as Gert's boat inched ever southwards, and Osrith focused on the movement to quell her yearning for what could now not be, a life with Tagged of Doire, gone, in flames. And now she was gone. It was a thing of Irian, Osrith knew, Gaelish, or pagan. It was well documented at the Armagh and Doire monasteries, one of many things Andra the novice monk had explained to her once, to be an abomination, so Osrith guessed it must have been Druid. To fast against someone was a serious thing, to withdraw all sustenance as a protest was grave and serious. The longer it went on, the more pressure there was from the wrongdoer to put right the wrong that the person fasting was accusing them of. And she was doing that, Osrith thought, as they bobbed towards the wide estuary of Hyke, Ulf hailing the fisher boats to their bows for trading, not with food but with labour. Domnall valued her for her worth as a peace cow, and had known, as King presumably had known, that she was of Bernicia, of Bibbenberg, and had exploited that. Osrith could see that now. So she was gone, withdrawing herself from the agreement they had made. Yet, she had sworn to Domnall, Osrith knew so very deeply, as she skimmed the water with her hand once the fishing boat was once again underway, sworn loyalty. Really, that meant she should have remained. That was one thing, Osrith told herself, the resolution forming within herself stronger with ever passing sea mile. She would never again bend her knee in loyalty to any king, any prince or any lord. She would fight for money, not loyalty. And she had very nearly married, too. Never would she marry. That left just one thing, Uhtred. He was her brother, who she last knew to be in the kingdom of Wessex. Uhtred, and also Father Becker were both in this kingdom, undefiled as it was by the Danes. She wanted so very badly to see him, and Becker. Yet, she was well aware that they had both left her to her fate. Whatever she did, Osric knew, she must be careful not to end up as his responsibility, for then, her life would be his to direct. Flounder was Osric's travelling companion when the fishing boat had passed mist-shrouded islands on England's south coast, and she shifted to one side of the boat, the place she slept now half filled with fish, and closed her eyes again. Gert shook her carefully by the shoulder and pointed a long wide finger to the coast, mouthing the word, Wessex, before standing back, waiting for her to sit up. She yawned, and blinked at the coast again. Yet, as Osric looked, there was a Danish warship tied up at a wharf. She felt to her waist, 2 weapons, both from Irishmen, under her hand. Tagged had passed her his Sikhs before he perished in flame. Domhnall, from whom she had won Buea, would be there, beside his cousins, loyally waiting out his exile in Domhnall's service. She resented the cowardly way she had run, and gripped her weapons in repentance. Danes? She asked, as Gert reached towards that morning's catch. She pointed out to the harbour. The Frisian turned his sunburnt face towards the vessel, his floppy blonde hair bouncing in the early morning breeze. Yes, Danes, he nodded, handing Osric the morning's net to unfasten. She let go of her weapons and took the net. Ulf scowled at her, but the sun was arcing higher that morning, and as it shone the warmth on her face made Osric happy, and she watched the trading ships at the mouth of the river as their crews unloaded and unloaded, and one raised its square, striped sails. It took much of the morning for it to get underway, its prow carved with a dragon head, and at its stern wooden stems in the shape of wings. Osric watched it as it left the harbour, only realizing its proximity as its wake washed out where the Frisian fishing boat had anchored. Only then, her heart began to beat faster, as Danes, fur-clad, arm-ringed, long-haired, fastened their vessel to girts. Several Danes hustled to the side, taking their eyes over the contents of the boat, taking in the nets and pots, the fish and line, and they jostled and pushed to begin a trade until one Dane, older than the men at the edge, heaved them out of the way, stamping a first-trapped foot onto Gert's boat. Neither Frisian had answered the Dane's demands for trade, and Osric had wondered whether that new to the Danish language, or the Dane's Frisian. But she realized as the Dane hefted himself into the boat that neither fisherman had answered, because they had been waiting for this man, who thrust his hand into Ulf's, and clapped Gert on the back. Hestin, Hestin, Ulf declared as he pointed to the lobster pots which they would use when they summered down towards Cornwall and Devonshire, and at the wide nets they used for trail fishing. Much of the catch that was being stored in buckets was crab, which had come from trade down the east coast, and the Dane Hestin had set about negotiating with Ulf for whiting, sole and herring as well as all their crab. He patted Ulf on arm as he scoured the stock and found what he liked, his arm round Ulf's shoulder as Gert folded his thick arms, watching them. Osric cast a glance at the Danes, who were watching their leader as intently. Then, Heston's hand rested on something which Gert immediately betrayed to be valuable by taking a frantic step in its direction, the cloth bag in which Osric had given Gert the silver as payment for her passage. Heston laughed, running grubby fingers through his braided hair, as he clutched the bag, then turned up Ulf, who looked straight at Osric. The conversation was too quick for Osric to follow, and where was the going to hide if she understood it anyway? Instead, she stared back at Ulf, shifting her fingers under her blanket to tagged Sikhs, the swell of the waves moving backwards and forwards, making Osric's mind link back directly to the Foyle estuary and her near drowning. She moved her hand down Buea, too, picturing Domhnall, Prince of the UNA tilde copyright till as Heston's eyes examined her body. Then, Osrith gripped Tag's handle as Ulf pulled her up from the bench at the stern of the boat by the shoulder, shaking her free of the covering and holding onto her arm tightly as Heston looked her up and down, then back to the silver. The rest was secreted within her clothes, Osrith told herself. There was more for him to find if Ulf was about to betray her, for he had already thrown the coin bag to a Dane standing behind Gert. Fast dialogue between the two men made Gert stride to them and Osrith listened to try to pick up any phrases. But it was unlike the Norsirik Thorgilson had taught her that Osrith could discern nothing, and instead, readied herself to pull Dag's seeks as soon as Ulf had let go. As panic rose in her throat, she had to get to Winchester. She must find her brother. Yet she didn't have to use the blade. Gert stepped between the Dane and his brother, pushing Osrith away, appearing to chide his brother and snap angrily at Heston at turns while pointing to Osrith past Ulf's chest. But the Danish leader still stared at Osrith, looking at her body as she stood there, warrior-clad. Then, glancing back to Gert, he stepped away, stepping past Ulf as his men boarded the fishing boat, taking the catch and throwing the empty wooden buckets back to the boat. No money had changed hands. The Frisian brothers had been looted. Gert watched the Danish boat sail away as the bright, warm spring day opened around them like a yellow daisy before turning to his brother, who was tidying the buckets and the nets. He said nothing for a while, his frame blocking the view of the Wessex coast before turning back and surveying the loss. Ulf, meanwhile, took the fishing net that Osrith was about to untangle and hid it away from at the prow. It was then that his brother turned and bore down on him, fist high. Gert punched his brother in the face, causing him to topple over the edge of the fishing boat. Osrith gasped and made to hurry over as huge, frantic splashes came from the port side, but Gert stood in her way. He took Osrith's shoulders, one in each hand, said something quickly but looking into her eyes trying to convey reassurance. Then, he took up her blanket and the tangled net. Ulf heaved himself out of the sea eventually, looking at Osrith through narrow eyes as he slithered into the bottom of the boat, but said nothing to her, and the uncomfortable silence persisting as Gert raised the iron cross spike and then the boat's sail and headed west. It took 2 more days until the Frisians got to Hammock, Wessex's large fishing port. Ulf refused even to look at Osrith now, his face sporting a lump which would eventually bruise from his brother's thump. And Osrith just waited for them tie up along with the many other craft, large and small. Yet none of them appeared Danish, and no animal figureheads adorned warship prows. It was the last kingdom of England to be truly free, different in character to Northumbria or Alba or Irian. The warmth, richness to the land, prosperous, rich. No wonder the Danes wanted it so badly. And Osrith suddenly felt a mantle fall from her mind, as if she could now see more brightly and clearer than before. She wasn't running from Alba, but striding with confidence to her kin, to the brother she had once glimpsed through a broken wooden palisade come to taunt their uncle with his mere existence. Yet Tag still had her heart, even in death. Though he was deeply Christian, Osrith suspected that his core was pagan. A little like herself. He was a man who, in his heart, knew as a fact, that the CHRONOLOGICAL. Osrith had done as the Morrigan had demanded of her, their oath to one another, in the land, on their way to Tara, and she, the Queen of the Sich, had been there, as she was present, always. But the great Chaos Queen of the Irish didn't live here, in Wessex. None of the Sich did. There was a surprising emptiness of spirit here in this southern kingdom that Osrith knew, now, to be their presence. Had they ever? Osrith wondered. The Druid, the bards had lived here once. But Osrith could no longer feel any presence of otherworldly spirits who lived beside the Irish Christianity in the north. That thought remained with Osrith as she watched Gert unload at the busy port what Heston the Dane had allowed them to keep. What he hadn't discovered in the panels at the boat's sides and the Frisian passed baskets of eels bought from Gypswig to Ulf on the quay. Skate, Ray and Osrith's sleeping companion Flounder soon followed. Gathering her blanket and rolling it up in a leather cord, she peered out at the port. with its cobbled dragways where bundles of what looked like cloth were being pushed up it by 3 men in a wooden crate. Its vessel was large with pale wooden planks. Osrith had never seen a craft so large, and it looked as if the crew had a tough job ahead of them as more cargo of the same size and shape was also aboard. Gert, meanwhile, had begun a brisk trade in his stock from people gathering around him and Dulf, and he briskly pocketed copper coins and a few silver ones, clearing out his stock in less than an hour. Just her to leave now, Osrith thought, and she made to climb overboard, into the shallow, muddy water, and she waited for her feet to wet as she anticipated working out the way to Winchester. There were plenty of people to ask, she figured. But the splash did not come, and all of a sudden, Gert filled her vision as he carried her out to the wharf cobbles, lowering her down until her feet met them. A guilty flush came to her cheeks. He had prevented her being abducted by the Danes, and they had taken the Frisians' silver she had given to them. They had brought her the length of the island of Britain, and had nothing to show for their protection of her. Behind her, Osrith noticed, Ulf ignored them, and she wondered about his hostility to her. Gert said nothing, and Osrith tried English to thank him, which he clearly didn't understand. Osrith knew no Frisian, so she tried Norse and then succeeded with Cymric where she had failed with Gaelish. "My thanks," Osrith began, hesitating as she sought for the words, the right words, that conveyed weight enough for her gratitude. Then, she felt words in her throat that her mind did not intend her to utter. "What did you say to them?" "The Danes?" "Heston?" Gert's ice blue eyes sparkled, then his thick lips turned up at the corners to match but still said nothing. "They did not take me with them because of what you said," Osrith pressed. "You are possessed by the sea witch giantess Wokilt and you bring us the good catches and prosperity." He pointed a thick finger to her chest, then back to his boat. "I said if they should take you, Wokilt would drag the warship to the seabed and drown them all with her giant tail." Osrith did not mean to laugh, but that the straightforward Gert had concocted the story made her think he believed it. Perhaps he did. "Thank you," she said again. Mean words against his generosity. Gert said nothing, but watched her. And a thought occurred to Osrith. He had no silver. She must pay her way. Scrambling around in her clothing, Osrith produced a handful of silver from her jerkin. It was about half she had left over from the original bag which she had found in the rowing boat when she had fled Bibbenberg. But Gert pushed her hand away. "You go, Wokilt, where you will." And the Frisian boy, now young man, successful fish trader around the British coast, turned and began his work again, collecting his empty baskets from the quay and striding back towards his boat. And they would leave. And here she was, Osrith of the Gales, of Alba, Irene and, of course, of Bibbenberg. Now, as the mid-springtime sun bathed her face, Osrith smiled, and began on her journey to where she last knew her brother to be, Winchester. 88,888,888. What in Helheim is that supposed to be? Utad was drunk, very drunk, and had just taken a piss at the back of the Two Cranes Inn, the passing of which had been disturbed by his loyal friend breaking into a drunken song. Looking over, Finan grinned, and hummed the refrain once more. They were back, having forced a retreat on Irikind and Siegfried Thurgilson, demanding Guthred's Cumbraland army to do so, allowed Ragnar revenge on Kjartan Sven, liberating Thyra and keeping Dunham. It had been difficult for Utad to leave Northumbria without first avenging his uncle and reclaiming Bibbenberg. Finan knew this, and that returning to Wessex was a wrench. So annoying Utad meant that he kept his friend focused. Oran Iron, he called back, as if that explained everything. Finan was more than a little drunk himself. Or, Anir, in, he pronounced the syllables slowly, which should make Utad understand them instantly. Ireland song, Yerajit, he added, clapping the now retrousered Utad on the shoulder. "You're in a good mood," Utad replied, as they stumbled back towards the pub doorway. "And why would I not be? I'm at liberty," he emphasized, "to fight next to you, Utad. I have food, shelter." He pushed on the oak door, stepping slightly unsteadily towards Clarpa and Citric, ale. He cheered as Utad's men matched Finan's toast to the watered-down drink in the mostly inn. And to Utad, Finan turned to him, grabbing up his tankard. Health, wealth, and to your continued favor with Alfred. If it lasts, Utad replied, raising up his tankard anyway. Gisela likes cooking. My children are safe. We are prosperous. Ethelfled is due to marry. Edward is growing strong. The king is as happy to have me as his warrior as I am to have his patronage. Yeah, agreed his men, all four of them raising up their tankards. If it lasts, Utad added, quietly, to Finan. Why wouldn't it? Silver from your Danish father Ragnar fell into his hand by the conduit of the most blessed Hildegith. He won twice, silver, and you. And he risked little in all of that by sending your brother Ragnar. Do you not consider it? Utad stared at Finan. I consider it daily. It is to my benefit too. Gisela is safe. Finan nodded. An agreement that suited them both. And Arion? He looked at Finan meaningfully. My own edged head. Finan shot back, remembering a better time. Yes, there weren't many. Utad was about to press his friend more, but Finan put his tankard to his lips pointedly, sipping deeply. When he put it onto the board, their warrior, lately slave, clarified nothing. Behind them, a young man in a monk's habit looked on, and further on, making to get up, his mind fixing on his uncle's words about the mighty warrior he called Erseling. But his nerve faltered. In the end, behind him, a girl working her trade, the oldest one in the world, twinkled at Sihrik before being hustled back away into an adjoining room, a curtain falling across the doorway by the irate landlord, who glowered in their direction. And her name's ? Finan promote. Sihrik flashed his eyes towards him, and blinked, as if being awoken from thinking faraway thoughts. The girl, Finan prompted. Leave him be. She's just a tavern whore, dismissed Utad, as Clarpa replenished their ale. Elfberg, Sihrik looked back at Finan. Utad banged his pot onto the boards of their table as Clarpa topped up its contents from the jug he had bought, and tutted. Come on, Utad, Finan chided mildly, you said yourself, you cannot choose who the gods gives you to love. Look at Father Buku and Thyra. Thyra is no whore. Utad shot back, starting forward. Finan said nothing, waiting for his friend to work out that he hadn't said that at all. Utad looked at Sihrik, and shook his head, but said nothing. Then Clarpa began to speak, holding out his ale pot. The raven flies into a tree, and bravely though the warrior be, he looks at that grave omen come, joined in Sihrik, to the tune that Clarpa was struggling to find. And forces legs still which would run, added Finan, until they were all singing the pre-Christian Saxon folk song. And away across the battlefield, flies sword and axe and spear and shield. 88,888,888. The good spirits Osrith felt a week before, knowing her brother was near and she had but to reach him, had all but evaporated as poor fortune followed after poor fortune. It was a mere 10 miles north to Winton Suista by the Roman road. She had been assured by a dock trader who she had seen buying from Gert at the quay, but when she had inquired into means of transport, nothing seemed forthcoming. It didn't help that her speech was different compared to the English Osrith spoke, and, after proffering a small sum to one textile merchant, who drove off with the silver but not Osrith, she set to walk to Wessex's capital. Silver was fast falling through her fingers as Osrith moved from tavern to tavern, living on the food for sale in the insalubrious institutions. She could not see another way to live in the city, until she was down to her last 2 coins. She had also hoped, in a vague way, that the taverns would be places where she may hear of her brother. But no one spoke of him, and when she went to church, to listen for a priest called Boker, she heard nothing either. One night, a month after being in Winchester, Osrith decided that her means were outstripping her ambition of finding Utad. She had enough for food for the next few days, but not enough for board. The nights were mild enough to sleep outside, wrapped in her woolen cloak, and she found a lee not far from the river, which would do while she contemplated what to do. because what she had been doing at the moment was a waste of time and money. Closing her eyes that night, Osrith contemplated her options. Returning to Alba and to King Domnall was out of the question, for it was acceding to his will, and his will was a marriage to benefit his crown. Even now, knowing that, Osrith still could not hate him. Oh, she had tried to hate Domnall MacCorstin pin, but, Osrith found, she could not. He was a king in the true sense, gaining power to lead his people. He had brought the idea of kingship to Alba through the Irish High Kings, literally, with the red sandstone block that he had placed at the meeting of the three kingdoms of Pitland, Strathclyde and Dalriada, extending the idea of king and god from Dun to the whole of the northern lands and, like Comsil had conferred godliness on the kingship of his ancestors, the Bishop of Iona had continued this at Scone, and to do this, like kings before him, he had to make harsh choices. No, Osrith could not hate a man she admired. Had he not, Finoli would not have been awaiting the slaver, and Osrith might not have had a chance to help him escape had he, in turn, not helped her. But there was another reason, one deeper in her heart, and one she knew she must get over quickly, tagged. Even now, in the black of the night, Osrith could see his face, determined and bold, crusting a soft creativity. Everyone listened when Tagged of Doia began to sing, or to tell a tale. It drew you in, you became part of that song or that story as long as the storyteller did not stop. And, on long, winter nights, the storyteller might have been telling stories for most of the night. But it was behind her, she had to pack up those feelings and never think of Alba, harden her heart, as she had done against Bibbenberg, her uncle, her once home. Just dash. A click in the blackness flicked Osrith's mind to her place in amongst the sheltered trees. Was there something there? Someone? She waited, watching. When nothing more came, she settled back down. Utad may not be there, in Winchester. But he had been. Thank heaven for monks sharing every scrap of information between monasteries that she had found that out in Caeliquilid. Someone would be there who knew of him, and she must find some sort of employment, for 2 pieces of silver would not last her long. But employment as what? She only knew fighting, being a warrior. It was what made her bold enough to sleep out of doors, even though there was still a great risk of being attacked if she remained on the tramp, because sleeping alone was dangerous. The most rewarding would to be accepted as a palace guard. She liked to fight because she was good at it. And, being at the palace meant more chance of hearing about her brother. Sunlight shone near the lee of trees in which she was sleeping and Osrith opened her eyes. The thought was now fixed in her mind, follow the river back down to Winchester and make inquiries about how she could work at the palace. A twig cracked beside her. Osrith got to her feet, feeling for Buet. No one seemed to be there. That meant nothing. Of course, an attacker could hide in any number of places, as she had done herself many times. A Dane, perhaps. They probably roamed around here, sizing up the city. It would be a matter of time until they attempted a re-invasion, as they had done when Alfred had fled. And then, rain began. Not just a few drops of springtime, but a great deluginal waterfall, washing past the lee of trees and down towards the river Richen. Osrith pulled her cloak around her, Buet in her hands, vertically in front of her. It would be slippery underfoot, so time would be an advantage. And lunged. Around the tree, wherever her attacker would be, he would be at the very least, surprised by the assault. At the very most, dead. But it was Osrith who was taken by surprise, as she stepped out of the shelter of the tree. A scrambling and whining met her. A she-wolf, small, and young, scrabbled back from her. Osrith lowered Buet. It was clear the animal was not going to harm her, and she wondered whether she had been sleeping in the wolf's sleeping place. More so, the she-wolf was clearly pregnant. Osrith turned back, pulling her cloak around her. No more sleeping out of doors if she could help it, she told herself, and strode off towards the capital of Wessex. The silver was to be gone by midday, Osrith knew, when she got to a slightly less sodden Winchester. She had clearly not been looking after her blade as she should have, and the edge was blunt. Ahead of her, thankfully, was the beginning of the commercial row, where trade and gossip flowed freely. People were crowded along it, as they were every day that Osrith had been there. The 2 Cranes Inn was nearer the other end. Turning off halfway along it and she would reach the palace. But she had to have Buet made good, or she would have no blade at all within a month. A blacksmith stood not far from the inn, and its thatched roof provided welcome relief from the incessant downpour and its forge warmth. Osrith unsheathed Buet as the blacksmith looked at her through deep-set eyes set within his large, red-burnished face. "My sword," Osrith said. "Sword," she repeated, taking out the blade. "It's rough, here." The man flicked his eyes to Osrith. He could not understand her properly, she could tell, but he did not flinch as the point of Buet moved in his direction. He looked at it, and then at Osrith, then lowered the point. "I have silver." Osrith offered the 2 coins to the man in her other hand. He understood that, and took Osrith's last 2 coins, carried with care from Alba and, before that, Sir Brit, who had bundled it into a boat, which Osrith, as Edra, had stolen to Fleeberbenberg, and put them beside the forge. "I can recast her," he said, looking over the blade. "I can put an edge back onto her." "Undo I?" Osrith asked, then in English, "Today?" "Today," nodded the blacksmith. So Osrith yielded Buet to the craftsman's fingers and watched as a link to her life in her immediate past was manipulated and mauled, bent and burnished, fire heating and water dousing the heat, as the fire also began to dry out her clothes. And, at length, the blacksmith paused.